sales or scripts or anything like that at all. This is just an opportunity to learn from Heather. Heather is a local and licensed therapist. I've known her for many years. She's been with KW in this capacity for now a couple of plus years. Everyone loves and adores her. It's hard not to. She's absolutely amazing. And so, yeah, the only thing we ask is just kind of, park yourself in, get comfortable. You can leave your cameras off if you're not comfortable having them on. And it's just a safe space. She always talks about unbelievably interesting and valuable topics. And hopefully you can kind of take some of that with you and use throughout your daily life. But without further ado, Heather, it's all yours.
Thanks, Chad. That was such a kind introduction. I appreciate that. Today, well, Chad's correct. I'm a licensed therapist in the state of Hawaii. I'm actually, coincidentally enough, licensed in Arizona, but I don't do a whole lot of work in there because I just celebrated 10 and a half years in Hawaii, and I really cannot imagine living anywhere else. So grateful that the islands have embraced me and allowed me to come and use my talents to serve all the folks that live here. Thank you, Alan, for the inspiration on the topic of grief. I think as I started to do some research and put this together, I realized that I spent 2 years doing hospice and bereavement work early on in my career and loved it, and really would have loved to stay with Hospice of Arizona, which is where I finished grad school. But they didn't have somebody that could supervise me to get my hours to become an independently licensed therapist. So it took my career on a different trajectory. For those of you that know me, it's to really working with folks that deal with more severe and persistent mental illness. But the topic of grief is so interesting to me and so layered. Thank you, Alan, for the word. There's so many things and directions that we could go with the topic of grief. So I'm going to give you a mini disclaimer, and then I'm going to give you a bigger disclaimer. But the mini disclaimer is this is not an all-encompassing hour-long topic. This is like, I'm giving you a tiny little piece of grief and the work that we do when we experience grief and when we try to understand it. So rest assured, there are lots more things that we could talk about. And as always, just like to drop this at the beginning, you guys can always send me topics that you're interested in. You can put them in the chat. I can jot them down. You can email me any of those things if there's something that you specifically want me to talk about. So our first slide is, we don't always do this, right? But there is a disclaimer today. Grief is a very heavy topic. It's also a very misunderstood topic. And sometimes when we talk about things that are heavier, or when we talk about things that are fresh to us, we were talking earlier about that this topic is appropriately timed because we're dealing with this tragedy on Maui, and grief starts from the day that we experience something. And so even if we feel like we're in sort of crisis mode and like stabilization mode, we're still experiencing the grief of loss and the grief of tragedy and the grief of natural disaster. So if you do feel overwhelmed, you feel challenged, you start to feel anxious, you can turn your camera off, you can take a deep breath, you can step away. But I want you guys to know that this space isn't intended to be like a requirement that you have to sit here and listen for 55 minutes. It's more of an opportunity for you to learn about things that are outside the scope of your usual day, and a way to invite you to talk about things that sometimes people feel are not supposed to be talked about or are trickier to talk about. So that's your disclaimer for today. And to set our intention, one of my favorite things to do is do a grounding exercise with folks before we start. But I'm going to give you the instructions and let you do it because there's lots to cover today. So our intention is to sit and be present and to take this kind of 55 minutes to really listen and take in the information so that we can better understand our own feelings and our own processes in our life. I love grief work and I love bereavement work because it's very raw and very vulnerable. And when folks come to therapy, the more raw and the more vulnerable you can approach the process with, the often more success you will have on the other side of it. So for those of you that have gone through therapy, you know that it's an ebb and a flow, right? Sometimes it feels like you're doing really deep work and sometimes it feels like it's not as deep. But, when we enter into this sort of situation, we want to make sure that, we're sitting in a comfortable position. We want to make sure that if our feet are flat on the ground and we're touching with all kind of the corners of our feet, that our hands are in a relaxed place and that we're taking bigger, deeper breaths than we usually do. I heard a statistic the other day that we take like less than 2 deep breaths a week. It really scared me for my own sort of parasympathetic nervous system. But today, because we're talking about a topic that can be heavier, I would encourage you to take a couple of deep breaths throughout the hour so that you feel grounded and intentional. So today we're going to talk about what grief is. It's not very easy to define, but we're also going to talk about when we know what grief is, what do I do with it? How do I hold it? How do I approach it? How do I talk to other people about it? And then I'm going to give you a little bit of more educational content, which is what the stages are and how we understand the stages of grief. And then thirdly, we're going to talk a little bit about like, how do I talk about it? How do I ask people for help? How do I help other people? How do I make sure that I'm not overstepping my boundaries? How do I make sure that I'm being kind and compassionate? So, grief. Grief is a response to something. Generally speaking, it's the response to some sort of loss. And the study of grief really started with how we respond to the loss of a person. So, some sort of living thing that has died. We've evolved into dealing with grief related to the death of pets. We've expanded to grief related to the loss of a significant position in the world. But essentially, grief is a response to a loss, particularly the loss of someone or some living thing that has died. But the most important part is that there was some sort of bond, or I love that they use the word affection, some sort of affection was formed. And, conventionally or historically, we've really talked about loss as this sort of emotional response that, it's how we feel and it's the heaviness. But what we've learned over time through research and study and feedback is that much like the 7 dimensions of wellness, there are many dimensions of grief. We have the physical experience, which for those of you that have lost someone or something that's very important or special to you, that physically you can like not want to get out of bed. Physically, you can not want to move your body. Physically, you can feel that sort of heavy weight on your shoulders. Cognitively, you get distracted. You start to feel like, man, a week ago I could handle all of this stress and I think there's something going on with my brain. And then behaviorally, right? Normally where you would be warm and funny and the life of the party, you sort of withdraw and you go internally. Socially, you either ask for more help or less help. And so you can see that grief is super layered. And we want to make sure that when we talk about grief, we talk about the response in the entire spectrum as opposed to just like how you feel physically or how you feel behaviorally. And then interestingly enough, there's an informal diagnosis of grief, which is a trouble or an annoyance, like when you give someone grief or when you experience someone else giving you grief. So we don't want to leave anyone out. So there are informal uses of the word grief too. I am going to pre-apologize. When I transitioned this PowerPoint, I missed this formatting on the next slide. So I'm very sorry that those words are not inside the boxes. I know. I'm sorry. Chad gives me a hard time whenever this happens, but I would have centered them if I had noticed them this morning. I'm sorry. So here are some of the main experiences that we have that directly relate to grief that impacts us in all of those dimensions. So the first is death of a loved one. 2 years ago, for those of you that don't know, I go every Christmas back to Chicago where I grew up, and I see my mom and my dad's side of the family. And the matriarch of our family lived to be 93, and she died 2 years ago Christmas. And first of all, she was a very punchy woman. I get a lot of my attitude from her and a lot of like my sort of like sassy wit from her. She never let me get away with anything, but she was probably my favorite grandparent. She was the most involved with my sister and I. She was always the one that I could go to if I had troubles or if I was experiencing emotional difficulty. She was the one that I could call, and she would, if she didn't have the answer, she would help me find it. And the last 3 or 4 years, we really lost her to Alzheimer's. And so she wasn't quite as there as she used to be, but she could remember her childhood memories like they were yesterday. So we got to hear a lot of stories in the last couple of years of her life. But the other day I was going through my closet and I took home a sweater that she used to wear every day when she would sit in her chair. And I kind of was like going through my shirts, and all of a sudden I came across that sweater and I had that little pang, right? And big tears came to my eyes. And, it's been a couple of years, but our experiences with human relationships don't just go away because somebody passed away, or don't just go away because we went to the funeral and we went through the house and we cleared up all of the last will and testament stuff. Like it doesn't just go away or stop. Um, I really wish she could have, I don't know, she didn't really want to live any longer, but I wish she was still here because she was lots of fun. But anyway, so death of a loved one is one of those experiences that stays with us, that impacts us on all of those dimensions ongoing. So us being understanding about our own experience with that type of relationship can help us absorb the grief as opposed to try and kind of punch it away. The other one is moving. People don't think about moving as a grief-stricken experience, but especially when you make a move like cross country, a move to another continent, a move specifically for a partner or spouse's job, like it takes you from one physical experience to a second physical experience. And the grief of not only leaving behind what you knew and what was familiar to you, also the grief of like not having that life anymore, right? Like not having the routine of friends, not having the routine of going to work every day, not having the routine of your neighbors. When you move, you essentially take yourself from one chapter, you close that chapter, and then you have to build a new one. And so it can become really grief inducing. And often it will make us question, like, what's my problem? I'm really excited about this move. Like, I'm glad to be moving, but our grief can sometimes confuse us because we don't realize that what we're leaving behind is hard for us. It's hard for us to negotiate with ourselves. The third is divorce. Divorce is a pretty common occurrence now in our day to day. My parents got divorced when I was 15. I think divorce is layered, right? Because you have yourself that potentially separates from your partner, but you also have grief that comes from how your kids or your extended family react to the divorce. And so we don't necessarily consider divorce a grief thing because often one or both parties are feeling relieved by it, right? When parties that are no longer wanting to be married separate, there's sometimes a relief from that, but we forget on the other side of that relief can be some grief, right? Grief from what you hoped the marriage would turn out to be, grief from what you hoped your parents' relationship would look like ongoing. So divorce is one of those tricky ones where we sometimes feel that complicated of like, why do I feel better, but I feel worse? And it can be tough to negotiate that again. Job loss. So this goes along with change in major life circumstances. Job loss is a funny one. So when I left the nonprofit, I kid you not, I walked out the door my last day and I was so happy and so relieved because there was so much pressure in that job that I didn't realize it was like slowly making me shorter. I'm a half an inch shorter now than I was when I started that job. So I firmly believe that somehow the burden and heaviness of that position really impacted me. But about a month after I left, after I was kind of fully ingrained in running my practice and, busy, I started to feel a little bit funny every morning. Like when my alarm didn't go off, I started to feel kind of weird about that. And I realized I was grieving the loss of a job and what I wished that job had looked like. I wasn't grieving the actual position that I held. I wasn't grieving the actual agency, but I was grieving what I wished it would have looked like for me to sit in that chair. And so we have this hopefulness that happens. And when we don't get that hopefulness, sometimes it can incite the grief process. So again, any sort of change in your major life circumstances can throw you sideways. And I think the more you can stop and take a breath and understand that grief is going to come into play, the more gentle you can be with yourself as it does. Thankfully, I fixed the 3 boxes on this slide. So I think the other slide is the only one that has the offset stuff. There is tons of research on how you approach the study of grief. And this one gave me something so simple that you guys can sort of either tack it on a Post-it note or, maybe memorize it if that's how your brain works. But the 3 C's helped me understand and try to relay this information in like a triangular effect, right? So the C's start with choose. So we get to choose how we respond to things. We get to choose how we ask other people to help us respond to loss and to heartache. We get to make a choice about the time frame that we're going to deal with. We get to make a choice about how impactful and encouraged our recovery from our grief process is going to be. The second is connect. We get to intentionally set connections so that we can feel supported during the grief process. So just as much as we can choose to isolate or not isolate, we can also choose who we connect with and how we connect with them. And then the third is communicate. You've got to communicate your needs to other people. Other people are not going to be able to read your mind. They aren't going to be able to tell you, this is how it should be, this is how you should feel. But you are going to be able to communicate to them, I need you to come and sit with me and not say anything. Or I need you to come to Target with me because my partner used to come to Target with me all the time. So as we start to approach the study of grief and what grief looks like in an ongoing basis, these 3 C's will help you in some ways put some logic to a very illogical experience. One is make some choices. Choose to leave the house at least once a week. Choose to connect with at least one person every other day. And then make the intentional choice to communicate your needs to other people. So as we start to look at choice in the grief process, we want to first understand that grief is completely unique to our own experience. So how my sister experienced the loss of my grandmother is different than how I experienced the loss of my grandma, which is also different than how my aunt experienced the loss of my grandma because she took care of her for the last 10 years of her life. So the grief process for us and the way that we choose to manage the emotional part of grief isn't going to look the same as it does for our sibling, our partner, our friends. The loss of control leads us to feel like we don't have choices, right? So when we start to experience the symptoms of grief, like depression, like crying, like weird random headaches that pop up when they're least welcome, that loss of control can help lead us to thinking that we don't have a choice in how we process the experience of grief. And so something like the loss of a home, when we experience the loss of a home, with that comes the loss of control of how I get up in the morning, how I wash and dry my clothing, how I prepare food for my family, how I let my kids play in the backyard. And so when we start to understand that grief comes with this significant loss of control around what we can and cannot do, our choice, our power of choice becomes much more important because we can choose to absolutely fall apart with that, which is totally appropriate, or we can choose to like put one toe in front of the next toe and take one small step and figure out what we're going to do next. One of the most interesting things to me in the study of hospice care and bereavement is this idea of grief brain. So if you look at your brain from sort of the cognitive stabilization of your humanity, right? It's the thing that you rationalize with. It's the thing that you logically put steps together with. It's the thing that you can pull consistency from. Grief brain is a complete tornado of everything that you're cognitively used to. So if you experience loss and you start to wonder why you can't get anything together and you can't seem to remember things that you need at the grocery store and you can't seem to remember to pick up your kid at daycare, it's all because of this phenomenon called grief brain, which is basically sometimes grief turns your brain into like a giant bowl of spaghetti. And the choice that we have in that capacity is, one, we can choose to understand that that's what we're experiencing and give ourselves a little bit of grace about it. But we can also choose to decide what the most important things for us to do are, and then put post-it notes up and put schedules up and put things in place that help us manage the messiness of how we're feeling and how we're thinking. At the end of each C, you'll see this square that says heavy burdened heart, because if nothing else, I want to tell you that grief comes with a heavy heart. And it's not something that you can rationalize your way out of. Lots of my folks that I work with really want to rationalize themselves out of how they feel. But how we feel is an emotional experience and rationalization is a cognitive experience. So you can't logic your way out of a heavy burdened heart. And when I was going through my clothes and I ran into my grandma's sweater, I had to give myself a little bit of permission to take the 5 minutes to just like be really bummed about it. And in that moment, that was my choice. My choice was I'm not going to pretend like I don't feel sad. I'm going to let myself feel sad and I'm going to let myself absorb that sadness and experience it rather than I don't have time for this. Our heavy and our burdened heart will only heal if you give yourself time to manage the way that you're experiencing the emotion. Any thoughts on choice or questions? For those of you that I haven't ever talked to in smaller groups or one-on-one, choice is one of the most powerful things that you consistently have. The second C is connect. This one's my favorite because connection is at the core of my philosophy of care. When we experience grief, we tend to withdraw into isolation. Isolation can be restorative, right? If you decide to respond to your feelings of overwhelmedness by escaping the drama of whatever it is that's going on, isolation can be very healthy. When you pack your suitcase and you bring your suitcase to isolation and then you unpack your suitcase and you put all of the clothes away and you decide to lock yourself in that room for 3 weeks, probably a less healthy response to what isolation is intended to do. Isolation is intended to give you time and space to heal, but not intended to create a brick wall between you and others. Connection, both socially, cognitively, educationally, spiritually, is one of the most important things that many cultures preach to our kids as they grow up, our adults as they grow up, this power of connection and having a collective. Secondarily, when we get to connecting with someone who's experienced grief or we are experiencing grief, there's no fixing. There's no solutions. There's no, well, you need to do this. We do not fix people who are grieving. We sit with them and then we allow them to grieve no matter how uncomfortable we are, no matter what the situation is. It is not our responsibility to say to somebody who is grieving, you can have another child. You can celebrate your grandparent whenever you feel like it. That is not what we do. That is not the power of connection. That is at times degrading and that is at times very disrespectful. We know that we are well-intentioned and we want to just fill the silence with something that will help us feel better, but there is no fixing in grief. Grief is a process that has to take its time and take its toll so that we can move through it and come to what we call a new normal. We don't get back to something, we create something new. And so when somebody's asking you for support, my suggestion to you is have a go-to comeback. Like, how is it that I can provide you with support? Would it be helpful if I, and give them an example? Would it be helpful if I came and prepared a meal for you? Would it be helpful if I came and walked your dogs for you so that you can just stay inside all day? And the idea of not fixing is what's going to open you up to connecting with folks on a deeper, I'm going to sit here with you and be present level. And just like it's important for us to ground ourselves into something like learning about grief, it's just as important for us to ground ourselves into exposing ourselves to someone else's grief process. When we're experiencing grief and all we want to do is shove something in the hole of despair and sadness, it's another opportunity for us to not fix what it is that we're experiencing. So not only are we going to not ask other people to fix it for us, we're going to do things like take it one step at a time. And we are going to do things like go for a 15-minute walk. And we're going to do things like instead of making coffee at home, we're going to walk down the street so that we can get some sunshine. We're going to connect with the things that help us feel just a little bit calmer, just a little bit more present. And again, we're going to recognize that grief comes with this very heavy, very burdened heart. And one of the reasons that we have celebrations of life, and one of the reasons that we have funerals is that folks come together and they connect over the collective grieving of the loss of a loved one. So give others the opportunity to be present with you and connect with you as you're experiencing the grief process. And when someone else is experiencing grief, all you have to do is show up. You don't have to fix anything. You don't have to solve the problem. And you definitely don't have the power to make that better. So understand that they're dealing with a heavy burdened heart and you're doing your role by being present. The third C is communicate. This one is probably the toughest for folks who are experiencing the grief because grief is not a linear process. Like we don't like experience the loss, go through a grief process, start the healing process, and then feel better. Like just like the other day for me, I went back to like wanting to, we'll talk about the stages in a minute, but I wanted to bargain and be like, well, if I could just have one more year with her, if I could just have one more Christmas with her. And we get into the process of trying to like negotiate what we need so that we don't have to feel what we feel, instead of understanding that if we communicate to people that we're struggling in the moment, they can help us by sitting with us and creating space with us. So the first rule of communication is to actually share how you're feeling. So for those of us that are introverted or have smaller groups of friends, this can be the point where you start to feel like you become a burden for your group of friends because the group is small and you feel like you've talked to them about this 100 times. But your people who are connected to you really want you to communicate how you're feeling with them. And they'll tell you if they don't. They'll say to you, like, I don't have the space to give you that today. But I would argue that at least 90% of the time, your friends or your loved ones are going to be like, yes, please tell me how you're feeling. I'll share some space with you. The other thing that we can communicate is our need to have not just a breakdown, but to break down our experience. That's why it's in 2 words. So when we experience the loss of anyone that we had an alliance or a communication or a connection with, we want to be able to break down the relationship, and we want to be able to talk about why it's frustrating for us to not have that person, why it's sad for us to not have that person. And as a therapist, people often ask me, like, how do you hold all of that for people? And the truth is I don't. Like, I don't have like a big bucket that I like carry around with me with everybody's stuff in it. I spend 55 or 85 minutes sharing space in which someone can alleviate some of their burdens, and we can share the experience of it and break it down into, do I want to do something about it or do I not want to do something about it? Because maybe right now I just want to be able to have a breakdown. Maybe I'm not ready to break the steps down, but you sharing space with me becomes this really safe, warm experience where I can unload some of my burdens and know that I don't have to take them all on my own. So that's where the authenticity comes in, right? When we communicate with someone, the number one thing is don't tell somebody that you can do something that you can't do. Don't tell them that you can show up every single day and prepare a meal for them if you are also taking care of your family. Don't tell them that you can drive them to work every single day so that they don't have to get behind the wheel of a car if you cannot do that. Do and say the things that you are able to do within the power that you have. Because remember, they're dealing with a very heavy and burdened heart. They're not going to be able to tell you that they're disappointed when you can't show up. So offer the things and connect with the things and communicate the things that you can do that are within your power, and then follow through on that. So maybe you want to, this is one of the, I'm sure you guys talk about this in your trainings, but you want to under promise and over deliver, right? So if you say that you're going to be able to provide a meal once a week and then you provide a meal twice a week, that's a wonderful surprise, right? Because you said you did what you said you were going to do, and then you even showed up a little bit more. So that heavy burdened heart that they're walking around with is going to feel just a little bit healed. Any thoughts on the 3 C's? Anything you all have experienced that doesn't track with this? Because I know grief is a really, really unique process for folks. Okay. Um, Chad, I think for the first time in monthly mindset history, We're not going to be able to get through all the slides. You can believe that. So we're going to do our best. Okay. The stages of grief are not an all-encompassing process. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross designed this grief cycle to give people a name to what they're experiencing when they experience loss. It has now turned into, instead of the 5 steps of grieving, sometimes people say there's 7 steps. So this is not your set all be all. This is the one that I use because these are the 5 most common things that folks vacillate between. And again, if you hear nothing else, like grief is not a linear process. So just because the process goes from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance doesn't mean that that's how you're going to experience. A lot of us actually experience depression first because the initial shock of experiencing loss doesn't take us straight to denial. It takes us straight into like the pit of despair because it flips a switch in our life. And all of a sudden, a person who was there yesterday is not here today. So as we talk about these, just remember we're talking about them in the order of her cycle, but it doesn't necessarily happen in this like strategic way. So the first is denial. I think about this more when we have like a surprise or a spontaneous loss, much like the Maui wildfires. A lot of us looked at it happening, especially in my experience from Oahu. We watched coverage of it on the news and we were like, that can't be happening. Like, this is not happening right now. And we're staring at the coverage of it thinking like, what do I do? Like, where do I, and we're in such a state of shock that we just can't believe that it's really happening. And so when we enter into denial, it's much like this woman kind of hiding her face from the experience of it. What I loved about this picture was it seems like there's like a tornado coming at her and she's trying to protect herself from this tornado. So often when we experience a loss, we initially go into things like confusion or avoidance, like what I can't do this right now. And when we enter into that sort of period of shock, it's really tricky for us to like rationalize our way out of it because denial is not a super rational emotion. It's more like I don't want you to be here, so I would like you to get out. And I'm going to talk about my granny a lot because this is the freshest loss that I have in my experience. But my granny was fine the night before. We had a big family dinner and we gave her junk food, which she wasn't really allowed to eat, but it was like from my favorite restaurant. And, you know, everybody was there. We had this big celebration. And then the next morning she had a stroke and didn't come back from the stroke. So there was a part of me for the rest of the day that was like, did that really happen? Because, you know, there was like hospice people coming in and the medical examiner comes, like all of this stuff happens. And you're kind of in this, like, yesterday I was planning on doing this. And now today I don't know what to do with this. So we go into this period of confusion and often there's safety in numbers in the denial, right? So if you have lots of family around or lots of friends around, you can all sort of pull from each other's little pieces of logic. And generally speaking, we then move into this idea of anger. How dare this happen? I've heard a lot of, how dare you leave me? How dare you choose today? And anger is a super normal emotion. A lot of folks tell me like, I just don't want to be angry anymore. But anger tells us something about our human experience, right? Like anger tells us that we're not quite ready to like manage the loss of that, or we're not quite ready to manage the frustration of that. And so often in our grieving process, while we're feeling sadness and while we're crying and while we're feeling this kind of heaviness and this feeling of burden, we're also like really pissed off and like really like angry at the person who's left us or the experience of losing them. And then we're irritated because now we got to deal with a bunch of stuff and we're not ready or prepared to do that at this particular point in our own process. So when you're starting to feel anger in like masked as frustration or masked as anxiety, understand that this is just, it's part of the process of actual grieving. It's part of being able to process through the connection or the relationship that you had and understand the loss of it. The third is bargaining, and some of us don't go through this stage. It can be very short. It can also be quite long because sometimes when we experience the loss, it becomes meaningful for other people and we start to talk about it more. So then it becomes an opportunity for us to tell our story over and over and over again. But bargaining is largely misunderstood because it's not just about if I had another year. It's also trying to bargain with your current life experience. So now that your normal is different than your normal was a week ago or 2 weeks ago or now a month ago, it can really be rooted in this like, well, what does it mean to be alive now? A lot of times when we lose a partner or we lose a friend, we struggle to figure out how we're going to renegotiate the group of relationships, right? So like if a spouse loses a spouse, what does it look like to move forward? Like what does it look like to do the next thing? Like yes, you have stuff you have to do. You have to prep the kids for school. You have to at times cook dinner. You have to do responsibilities. You have to pay bills. But like, does it matter? Like, is there any meaning in that? And during this kind of bargaining stage, if we're leaning into those 3 C's, we're reaching out to other people to help us negotiate what it looks like next to create this new normal. And in this bargaining stage, we're starting to take the time to really tell our story and talk about our experience. We've moved through a lot of times the denial part. We might still be feeling a lot of that anger and anxiety, but now we're telling our story and trying to, again, negotiate what it looks like on the other side of this, right? So I'm not a everything happens for a reason person, but this is a lot of times where people reach for that, like, okay, this must have happened for a reason. This must have happened because of something. So as you tell your story and as you seek compassion and guidance and support from other people, you're going to start to try to understand what your story looks like going forward. I probably said, this isn't about getting back to normal. This is about creating a new normal. 7,000 times in a couple of years that I worked at hospice because people really think like, I just have to get back to, I just have to get back to. When in reality, we're really trying to get to something else. We're trying to recreate something else. We're trying to rebuild or build something else that, yes, can have familiarity to us, but is going to look totally different than it did before the loss. The toughest stage in the grief process really is depression. Not everybody experiences this particular stage. I think about, when my aunt and I were talking a couple weeks after my grandma passed, she said, I know you're not my therapist, but is it okay that I feel relieved? And I said, of course it's okay that you feel relieved. Like my grandma's not in the best of health the last year. And quite frankly, with her Alzheimer's came some nastiness. Like she wasn't the nicest person to my aunt who was her caregiver 24/7. So there are human emotions that we experience in loss that we give ourselves a hard time for that are totally normal. And when we move into this kind of depression phase, it comes not only with the emotional capacity of depression, but it also comes with the physical impact of depression, right? This is things like, I don't know what to do, so I'm going to do nothing. This is, I'm so tired that all I can do is lay in bed. This is, I'm so angry at the loss of my human that I'm going to hate everyone that I come into contact with. And then sometimes during depression, we also experience this idea of flight or wanting to escape from the experience. So if we pretend that it's not happening and if we escape from it, then we can not have to manage it and not have to deal with it. And depression is very confusing because again, our logical brain comes in with like, we need to go to work. We need to go do things. We will feel better if we do things. But depression has like, steel chains attached to it sometimes. And so it can take those kind of baby small steps to really pull yourself from what you're experiencing physically and emotionally and make some of those more cognitive or more rationalized decisions to see if it helps to heal some of the depression. Any thoughts on that? Again, depression is also not sadness. So when we experience the sadness of a loss, it's different than depression. Depression is an all-encompassing. Sadness is an emotion that we experience. And then this is the one that generally happens at the end of your grief process, but we can go from acceptance back to denial. Like it's not impossible. So a lot of times where acceptance comes is the idea that it's okay that we're creating a new normal. Not that the loss is okay, not that the grief is ever going to totally go away, but that it's okay for us to look like what it's going to, or us to explore what it's going to look like on the other side. So again, acceptance is not about finality. It's more about, okay, I can get to a point where I can make some plans. And I put the last item on this slide, moving quote unquote on, to remind you that there's no such thing. So if you encounter people who are well-intentioned, who tell you, well, you just got to move on from the experience, you can use whatever response you want to, but most of the time my response would look like something like, well, you have no idea what you're talking about. I'm not moving on from anything. What we do in the grief process is we move through something. There's no such Heather that exists without her grandmother. The relationship was important. The relationship was significant in my life. There's no such thing as moving on from that. What I will do is move through the grief process and come to a place of acceptance that while she's no longer here, I can celebrate her in ways that I want to celebrate her. So I want it, I guess if you come away from nothing else today, one of the things I would like you to take away is there's no such thing as forgetting, and there's no such thing as moving on. There's only moving through and coming to a place that's different than the place it was before. So the 5 stages are a way for us to understand our grief in a way that makes sense to us. And sometimes when we have a word to put to the way that we're feeling, it'll help us feel a little less harmed by experiencing the grief process. Sometimes it'll give us permission to be able to feel what we want to feel. So some of the most common symptoms of some of the most common symptoms of grief that you will experience are in these 4 circles. I will tell you that most people that I've worked with have experienced all of these symptoms in some way, and a lot of times they're co-occurring. So not only are you feeling restless, you're also not wanting to eat. Not only are you feeling detached from your community, but you're also questioning, what does it all mean? Not only are you crying, but you're also experiencing insomnia. And so, again, the physical symptoms, sleeplessness, restlessness, insomnia, are feeding the spiritual symptoms, feeling detached, isolating, questioning your spirituality or what it all means, which are then perpetuating the physical symptoms of crying, having difficulty concentrating, not being able to do your work. Often we have headaches because crying compresses our brain in such a way that it can actually create headaches. I don't know if you guys knew that, but crying is a very healthy output, but at times because of the compression, it can also give you a little bit of a headache. So keep that in mind that it's very normal after you cry. And then can also impact this, emotional component of feeling guilty, this emotional component of like not wanting to eat because eating feels a certain way. And then ultimately the stress of having to not only manage your grief, but often manage like the logistical things of someone's death. I remember my aunt making phone calls to people and she's like, how many times do I have to tell this story to people? Like, can't I just do like a Facebook post? Is that okay? And of course it's okay. Like you don't have to call everybody individually, but these are the symptoms that will come out of the experience of not just losing the relationship that you have with someone, but it'll also impact and affect the way that we experience the ongoing grief process. Thanks, Steve. I'm glad it's helpful for you. So if we're gonna look, Chad, I did it. I got us to have time for a question. Um, the first thing I want to remind you guys is that grief is not a linear process. So how you feel today is not going to lead to how you feel tomorrow. Tomorrow you might feel worse than you did today. But if you make those connections and if you have people or a way to connect with yourself or a way to connect with your spirituality or your religion, that connection will help give you the foundation of what it looks like to move through and into this idea of what the new normal looks like. I had a friend whose husband died pretty early into their marriage. And one of the things that was the toughest for her was they used to go running together in the morning. Like every morning they would run together. And she couldn't go back to running because running just reminded her that he wasn't there. And so we started walking after work, not because we were trying to replace that experience, but because she needed something to help her move through the difficulty of losing that experience that she had to connect with her partner every morning. And it was really unfair, right? It was unfair for the universe or whatever you believe to take her husband away from her and take that experience away from her. So we then really leaned into maybe we didn't talk the whole walk. Maybe our time together was silent. Maybe our time together was her crying during the entire walk. We just let it be what it was until one day, she felt a tiny bit better. And she was like, will you tell me about your day? And so I would tell her about my day. And then the next day she would cry. And then the next day she would say, can you tell me about your day? And then as time moved through, we developed a new normal. And then she started walking by herself. And then she started saying, I'm going to walk with this other person. So, understanding this grief process and understanding how important connection is, and then using this idea of patience, like how she was experiencing grief was how she was experiencing it. So I needed to, one, not take it personally. There's almost nothing personal in the grief and recovery process, unless you're in family drama and dynamics, which is a whole other lesson or a whole other mindset. But if we use time and patience in our relationships and we kind of continue to show up, we can then help our folks deal with and manage the moving through process. We did it. Tell me your thoughts. I really want to hear about your guys' grief processes and your questions that you have. I put my little contact information at the bottom of the slide if you want to call me and talk to me about it.
I'll be vulnerable and chime in
Oh,
as I prime things for everyone else to get ready. But with regards to personal loss, this is interesting. As I self-reflect on a couple of things, I've had a couple of very, very significant losses in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, very, very close losses. And I feel I haven't grieved at all. And it's not that I think about those individuals probably on a daily basis, but I haven't had what one could consider or that Hollywood or movie script type of thing. Not that should be the benchmark by any stretch, but I haven't had that. And then there's also that little bit of guilt, like, hey, wait, why haven't I had that? Why can't I make that kind of connection to it? And it's tricky, right? Because then there's a guilt part of it. Then I tend to kind of over reflect, and then I'm like mentally honoring that individual. And it's just all these different things. And oddly enough, it usually comes up in times that are completely unrelated, where I might be watching an Instagram or TikTok video of something that reminded me of that person. And then I'm like halfway to losing it. And I'm trying to like put it back together again, because I'm like, wait a minute, am I crying for the video or the person? It's this whole dichotomy. And what my fear always is I kind of push it aside, go, okay, never mind. I'll get it together, stand up straight and kind of move things forward. And what I always am concerned about is that'll creep up and manifest itself in something else, in some other way, in another conversation, in another event, of another, it's another brick that I'm adding to my bag that I'm kind of lugging around as I go.
Yeah. Yeah. I love the way you describe that too, because one of the things that didn't come up in today's is that you may not experience any of this, right? Like sometimes we experience loss and the loss is not impactful for us. And I need to tell you that that's okay. Like not every loss or death or major life experience is going to impact you and affect you the same way that something else was. So you might be surprised by a major life change, but not have a reaction to someone's death. So I think one, you can give yourself permission to sort of process your grief and loss the way that you process it. Again, some of us tend to the more logical side of things, and we're like, yes, this happened. Yes, I have a feeling about it, but I don't need to sit in it for long periods of time. But what I also hear you saying is, am I actually just like putting more rocks in my bucket? And now my bucket is getting heavier and I have to carry that along with me at all times. And the truth is, no, you don't. That's kind of what I was alluding to in the beginning of the session is like when people come to me and they're like, I'm so X about this situation, we work on unloading the X so that I can take some rocks out of your bucket and then you don't have to carry them around anymore. So you don't have to have an excessive response to something to carry around little pieces that are still heavy. That was really good. Thanks, Chad.
And kind of related to that, I feel like, you know, like as these rocks build up, because you're kind of like, there's a, I don't know if you want to call it a fear or whatever, that like at an inopportune time or moment of which you have zero control over, all of these rocks are going to fall out on you, you know. And that kind of can create some anxiety or whatever. Yeah.
I remember a couple of years ago, this was before COVID, so I guess more like 4 or 5 years ago, but I was giving a presentation on something around houselessness. And somebody asked a question about housing folks who have pets because it can be trickier. A lot of places don't want to take pets. And I started to tell a story about a dog that had died a few years prior. And that's what happened, Ellen. Like all the rocks came pouring out of my eyeballs. I was like, I want to apologize for crying. I'm not going to, but clearly I'm missing my little therapy dog who used to come along with me to work all the time. And so I think, that's part of the acceptance piece of like, sometimes stuff is going to come out when we like really don't want to, like in front of, 250 people when you're like the speaker. But again, a nod to our humanity, right? That like grief's not an educational or cognitive process. It's a way of experiencing something that doesn't make sense to us. So I think the most helpful thing I can tell you, so I'm trying to read the chat and talk at the same time, but the most helpful thing that I can tell you is it's okay. Like the bucket's going to spill at some point. We hope it spills with like a trusted confidant, but maybe it spills in front of, 250 people. That's just the way it goes sometimes. So.
I'd just like to say, this is an opportune time. We're here on Maui and we're experiencing community grief. I personally have not lost anything. I've known people who have lost everything, including their lives. But it's just so hard just interacting with people in public because there's so much grief in the community.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. I went through that the first couple of weeks. My business partner lives on Maui and she just went into like total fix it mode and was like delivering supplies and driving to and from. But the heavy heart part is a shared grief. And so when a community experiences grief, you not only feel the burden of your own grief and your own heavy heart, but you in some ways absorb the grieving and the heavy heart of your community. And I, for one, appreciate how so many folks on Maui are just taking care of each other. Like they're just showing up. They may not have the answers. They may not be able to provide anything, but they're showing up and they're just allowing people to experience what they're experiencing. And I would keep in mind, since you shared that, Kathy, I would keep in mind that it will ebb and flow, right? You'll get to a week where you're like, okay, things are feeling a little bit less heavy, and then you may have another heavy week. So
Mhm.
yeah, that's a perfect time for grace for yourself and others. Any other thoughts or questions? Recognizing it's 10:59. Well, I am so grateful this topic was so inspiring for you folks and so aptly timed. I think that we could probably talk more about the grief process. So maybe I'll pull from the depths of my brain and talk about things like complicated grief and other things in another future presentation. But thank you for having me. Thank you for letting me share my loss of my grandmother and the reminders of it with all of you. And thanks for being a trusted space for me and for each other.
Thanks, Heather. And thanks everyone for coming on. We always appreciate it.
Yeah, mahalo, Heather. Thank you. You guys have a great weekend.
Will do. Bye, everyone.
Bye, guys.